Welcome to this lecture on the OT process. So in this lecture, I'll take you through some of the definitions of the OT process, and then we'll look at some of the examples of OT processes that have been published. And then at the end, hopefully we'll be able to identify some key stages that we can find in all the different types of OT processes that I'll be presenting on. Okay, so to define the OT process, there are many definitions in literature that you might come across, but I just selected to use these three. The first one is from Rosemary Hagedorn, and she defines the OT process as the deliberate, effective, and efficient steps or actions taken when working together with clients to find solutions to occupational problems, occupational needs, or occupational issues. So that's Rosemary Hagedorn. And then the second one is from Jennifer Crick, where she defines the OT process as a process of collaboration and negotiation between the therapist and carer, in which the client is helped to identify her or his problems and goals and to find effective ways of dealing with them. So, Jennifer Crick there is bringing in the aspect of the carer or the family of the person who is being helped as the client or the service user. And then the third one is from Shell, defining the OT process as the therapeutic process which evolves as the OT and client work together to carefully analyze the client's occupations and performance limitations and using interventions that are supported by research to meet the occupational goals of the client. So that definition brings in an aspect of using evidence to make decisions about our assessments or our interventions. So I quite like these three definitions. Right. So moving on to the examples that I'm going to be covering in this lecture. I'm going to talk briefly about the Crick's OT process, and then I'll talk about the OPPM. That's what we call the Occupational Performance Process Model. That's a Canadian one. And then there is a CPPF, which is also a Canadian one, the Canadian Practice Process Framework. And then I will end with the OTIPM. That's the Occupational Therapy Intervention Process Model by Ian Fisher from the US. So if you remember from my other lecture when I was presenting on the hierarchy of OT knowledge and the use of terminology, these are OT processes, but you'll find the OPPM has got model in it, and then the OTIPM also has model in it. But these are not conceptual models. They are actually occupational therapy processes. So just to clarify on that. Right, so the first one, Crick's OT process. This was developed by Jennifer Crick, and it includes 11 stages outlined by Jennifer Crick, starting with the first step, which is referral or reason for contact. So in that stage, what will be happening is the OT is making decisions on the appropriateness of each referral. So when the referral comes, it might be coming from the members of the multidisciplinary team, might be coming from very, very many different places. It could be a self-referral. It could be the person has been referred by a charity or by an organization, by their neighbor, or maybe they saw something on the internet and then they figured out they need to see an occupational therapist. But of course, it will depend on the setting because some settings only accept OT referrals from specific sources. But in general, a referral can come from any direction. It might be a self-referral. So what then happens after the referral has been received, the OT is making a decision whether this referral is an appropriate referral for occupational therapy or not. Linking back to my other lecture on the hierarchy of OT knowledge, this is where the OT is actually looking at what the client or service user is looking for, what help they are looking for. and then making a decision whether this aligns with OT philosophy, with OT theory. If it doesn't, then it might mean that the referral is actually inappropriate, and then they might need to be signposted to a better referral, to a better service provider by the OT. Then moving from referral to information gathering. So information gathering, this is when the OT gains information from diverse sources. It could be if there is any referral letter. It could be if the person is coming with a carer or caregiver, they are getting information. It could be from family members. So the OT is getting information from diverse sources about the occupational challenges that the client is having. And then from there, we then move on to initial assessment. So for initial assessment, um, um, the focus there will be answering questions like, what type of assessments do we need to use? Do we need to use standardized assessments? Do we need to use non-standardized assessments? Is it the environment that we need to assess? Do we need to assess the person's performance components? Which occupations can we focus on in our assessments? So all those decisions are being made in that step. And then after that, the next one is reasons for intervention or needs identification or problem formulation. This is where the occupational issues or presenting occupational needs are actually identified, and then the priorities are made in terms of what needs to be addressed and in what order. And then that then leads to goal setting, where CRIC defines the goals as the targets that the client hopes to reach through involvement in occupational therapy. And once that has been done, then the action planning is then done in terms of the intervention, what intervention is required, and what steps do we need, what equipment or material do we need. That those are the decisions that are being made there. But the key thing is that occupation is being used as a therapeutic media, and there are aspects of grading. You will learn more about the principles of grading, how we can make an intervention easier so that the service user can be able to actually achieve, or how can we increase complexity as the service user is actually improving in their occupational performance. Is it about sequencing? So all those aspects need to be considered in our intervention planning and intervention, or action rather. And then from there, Jennifer Crick adds the step of ongoing assessment and revision of action. So in other words, what will be happening is the action is being implemented, but then there's ongoing assessment to see whether the action that we are taking is actually making a difference in the life of the client. If there is need to make adjustments, then those adjustments can be made rather than to wait for the whole duration of the program. If it's a 4-week program or 6-week program, rather than to wait until week 6 to evaluate and see whether we're making a difference, ongoing assessment can actually be happening. That flexibility then allows the therapist to adjust the action according to the need. And then from there, there's outcome and outcome measurement. So in outcome measurement, usually this is done at the end of the intervention, when the OT is actually evaluating to see whether the interventions or the actions have actually made a difference. Has the goal been achieved? If we've made a difference, to what extent have we made a difference with our intervention? And from there, then the next stage will be end of intervention or discharge. We're looking at discharge planning, documentation, if there's need for onward referral or to other service or to other support systems, maybe in the community. All that documentation is then done there. And then the last stage, the 11th step, will be review and reflection. This is mainly in order to safeguard good standards of practice. What went well? What is it that we could improve in the process that we followed with this particular client? And then learning from that will then be used for future engagement with clients. Okay. Because of the format that I'm using to record this. This clip is not going to play for you, but I'll summarize what Jennifer Crick said. Sometime ago, I had an opportunity to interview Jennifer Crick on another topic, but I didn't want to let that interview finish before I actually asked her about the Crick's OT process. And she was explaining that the OT process in the book, it looks linear, and sometimes that can be misleading. In actual fact, the process isn't linear, but she put it there simply as a guide so that novice OTs or people who are learning or training to become occupational therapists, they can have an understanding of the steps that are involved, but they are not necessarily in a linear format, which I thought was interesting. So if you're able to access that video, you will then hear for yourself how she came up with the OT process. Right. Okay. So we move on to the next one. The next OT process that we're looking at is the OPPM. So OPPM was developed by Virginia Fearing in 1997, together with Mary Law and Clark. Mary Law, I think by now that name, you will remember it from the PEO model. So they were working together as well for the development of the OPPM. The OPPM has got 7 stages. So at first, the first thing that happens is when the client is presenting with some occupational performance problems or occupational performance issues, there is need to be able to name those problems, validate those problems, and be able to prioritize those problems. So in terms of this process, OT enables the client to identify self-care, productivity, and leisure problems. So these problems are being framed in terms of occupational performance rather than in terms of performance components. What I mean is, instead of these problems being framed as, or the patient or the service user or the client has got limited strength, or they've got limited range of motion, we're actually framing the problem in terms of the occupation. They are finding difficulties with dressing themselves, or they are finding difficulties with performing their work duties as an accountant. So that's how we're framing these problems. And then, so that was the first step, and then moves on to second step. The second step is about selecting potential intervention models. So like I presented in the other lecture on the hierarchy of OT knowledge, conceptual models, we're considering conceptual models to be like the lens through which we look, a way to see the client's world. So that is done very early into the OT process. And the choice of the theoretical frameworks will influence the assessments or the interventions that we're going to use. And then from there, moving on to stage 3, identifying occupational performance components and environmental conditions, as well as stage 4, identifying the strengths and the resources. So this is a collaborative process actually between the OT and the client to identify these strengths, their skills, resources that can assist, their assets that can assist in resolving the occupational performance problems at hand. So it's actually a shared vision between the OT and the client, where we're looking at the starting point when there is an occupational performance problem, and then looking ahead into the future to a destination where the occupational performance problem is resolved. So similar to Crick's, occupation is the meaningful therapeutic tool. In Crick's, we're saying occupation is the therapeutic media. And then stage 6 then looks at implementing plans through occupation. And then when those plans are implemented, stage 7 looks at evaluating the occupational performance outcomes. So the question that is being asked there in stage 7 is, were the occupational performance problems resolved? So if they are resolved, it then moves on to resolution. If they are unresolved, it might mean that maybe they need to the client needs to be referred to another service so that that particular problem can be resolved. Or it might mean that we are coming back to stage 3, where we try to identify or reassess and then establish new goals that we can work on. So addressing of a problem may be done in one setting and resolution in the other different settings when the client is referred or they get an onward referral to another service. Right, the next one is the CPPF. CPPF was developed by Helen Polataco, Janet Craig, Jane Davis, and Elizabeth Townsend. And by now, I think some of these names are familiar names. They are also based in Canada. The CPPF, in a way, it might be considered as an improvement of the OPPM. The emphasis of the CPPF is on flexibility of the process. And it also considers the client to be either an individual, a family, a group, an organization, a community, or even a population, whereas the OPPM was mainly referring to the client as an individual. So the dotted line between the practice context, if you look on that image, there are two squares there. The dotted line between the practice context shows that practice happens within societal context. So in other words, whatever we are doing in practice is influenced by the context in which we are practicing as OTs. And the big circle, which is encompassing the 8 stages, it represents the theoretical frameworks. It's labeled frames of reference, but that includes, it represents the conceptual models, the frames of reference, the constructs and concepts in occupational therapy and occupational science. So for this process, it starts, the first stage is enter or the initiate stage, and then it then moves on to setting the stage. So setting the stage, this is where the client's perceived occupational performance issues are being established, as well as the occupational therapist's clinical opinion and possible theoretical frameworks. So at that point, it could be similar to the initial information gathering, if you like, if you want to compare it to Crick's process, for example. So it's happening there. Once that has been done, the OT has got an idea of what conceptual model they are going to be using or what frames of references they are going to be using. Then we then move on to assessing. It says assess, evaluate. So that sort of like captures the language used in different parts of the world. But basically for our context, we're saying that stage is actually assessment. And then when that has been done, there's an agreement on the objectives, and then the plan is implemented, and then there's modifying or monitoring. Modifying or monitoring of progress. This can be linked to Crick's process, where she mentions ongoing assessment to see whether we're actually making a difference as we are proceeding with our implementation treatment plan. And then from there moves on to evaluation, where we're looking at have we achieved what we wanted to achieve. And then from there, if everything has been achieved, we then conclude or we exit the process. The flexibility of the CPPF comes through the alternate route. If you look at the diagram, you see that there are solid lines which are representing the basic steps, and then there are dotted arrows that represents the alternate route. So with the alternate route, the CPPF is just trying to illustrate to us that there are some services where once you've initiated the OT process, you've set the stage, you've done the assessment, you might then need to already move on to exiting the process. For example, there are some services that are, for example, autism assessment services. All they do is to assess. So they can still enter or initiate the stage, set the stage, assess and evaluate. And then once they are done with the evaluation, they are then concluding or they're exiting. the service user is then referred to the service that provides intervention. So similarly, some settings, they might do an assessment, agree on the objectives. Depending on the setting, if the intervention has to be implemented in a different setting, then they will consider exiting at that point. There can also be another alternative route where when evaluation is being done, the OT and the client might then realize that, oh, okay, we've maybe partly achieved the goals that we're having, but we could adjust our goals and do something else. So that's where you see from evaluate, there's another dotted arrow that goes back to agreeing on objectives and plan. So it's the flexibility that they were trying to highlight in this process. Right. So this is the last one that I'm presenting in this lecture, the OTIPM. The OTIPM was developed by Ian Fisher in the US. The first version was in 2009, but this image shows the current version from Fisher and Mattarella 2019. So the OTIPM, if you look at it like this, it might look overwhelming and complex, but once we start breaking it down, it's really not complex. And by the way, for this module, this is the OT process that we're going to be using in our module. If you ask me, is it the best OT process? For me, not necessarily. Any of the processes that I've presented could actually have been used, but we just selected to use this one for the module. So OTIPM has got 3 key stages. There's phase 1, which includes evaluation and goal setting. So remember, in terms of our terminology, in our context, where OTIPM is saying evaluation is actually assessment. And then phase 2 is intervention, which includes the different approaches or models as they are presented by the OTIPM. But in our context, we know that these are actually frames of reference. Okay, and then stage 3 is the re-evaluation stage. In our context, we are saying this is the evaluation stage. This is because of the differences in terminology between occupational therapy texts that are originating from the US and occupational therapy texts that originate from the other parts of the world. So these are the main phases of the OTIPM, and we will go into detail with each of these stages and each of these steps. I might want to bring to your attention as well that in phase 1, where it says implement performance analysis, that's basically assessment. So that's the assessment according to the OTIPM. Right, so we will have time to go in detail with this, so I'm not gonna go into detail at this point. So if we look at the OT process that I've presented, you will be able to see that there are some key components of the OT process. There are key components that we can identify in each of the OT processes that I've presented. And these key components will be assessment. For all the processes that I've presented, there's an aspect of assessment. There's a stage that has to deal with goal setting. There's a stage that deals with intervention planning, intervention or action implementation, as well as evaluation. So you got to trust the process. But if you don't agree with all these processes, or if you see that they are not relevant to your setting or where you are, why don't you just suggest another one? Thank you very much. And here are my references.